Hey everyone, Arctic Klein here, Average Picker. So I thought it was about time we go and do an update on challenge lock pins. I have that small little series where I go through and look at different challenge lock pins and kind of how to make them and what they do. And in this one we're going to be looking at the T-pin. Okay, so what we have here are three hurriedly made T-pins, and two of them are not really that great, and a third one that's pretty all right. And that was done intentionally, and I will show you why in just a few moments when we get into making them. But basically, a T-pin, we'll take the all right one here, hopefully got a good focus on it, is basically just a pin that has kind of a reduced diameter tip on it. And this can be mixed and matched, of course, when you start getting into some of the crazy challenge lock pins. You know, you can get you can cut a spool and leave a little bit of a tip on the end and come up with kind of a T-pinned spool. But generally, this is what is the basic, just a T-pin by itself. Now, if we take two of them as drivers, and we put and face them off against each other. And I know this is not the best one here, but this kind of gives you an idea anyway. This is often referred to as a drunken spool because it takes on that sort of spoolishness, I guess. However, it is split in the middle, so we call it drunken. Now, of course, the point of a T-pin is that it picks like any normal pin, but as it comes up and rises to the shear line, you suddenly get a little shift in the core, and that reduced portion catches in the shear line. And it's having some difficulty here simulating that, but you can see it's going to get hung up and cock at a little bit of an angle, kind of just depending on how well your pin generally fits the chamber. Now that can do a couple things, but one of them is if, as you're picking and you get the click down off of that, you may think the pin is actually set when it is actually hanging on by just whatever that nub is. And locks that end on a T-pin, I will go out on a limb here and say it can be a bit of a surprise when you do open them. You will often know, as the picker, the lock feels like it's at its tail end, and you're just going around and you're kind of nudging all those key pins inside, and then suddenly the lock opens up. And what's happened is one of those key pins has just given that T-pin the final little bit of nudge that it needed. But there's not really what I would call crisp feedback coming off of that T-pin. So making them is quite simple. You get them chucked up. My camera is just doing weird focusing. You get it chucked up in your Dremel or your drill, and take your file and you simply run across the exposed part as flat and level as you can until you get that reduced to pretty much however much you want it reduced by. Now, core-wise, you do want to be careful if you have construction holes. I'm not sure if this one will actually fit. You probably want to fill these construction holes because these T-pins, as you can see, depending on which way the lock is being picked, they can fall in these construction holes, and you will then generally have bricked the lock, and it's not going to be recoverable with the key. Depending on, of course, the lock build, you may be able to go in through the top of it or something and get the T-pin freed up. But from a challenge lock build standpoint, if you're going to be using T-pins, you really want to, or anything reducing diameter, to be sure to fill those construction holes in. Now, I'll point out too, on the off chance that you have jewelry saws and not jewelry files, it's kind of an odd way to start. Most people, I think, start with files as opposed to saws. These are still able to be made. And again, you'll chuck them up and get them turning. And what you'll have to do is you'll come in and you'll make your cut. And as you're cutting, you'll want to very gradually turn that jewelry saw on its side and start kind of filing in and cutting in towards the chuck. That keeps the pressure of the pin going into the chuck, so it's less likely to go flying out as opposed to if you started on the inside of it and started turning and then working out. Even if you have it chucked down pretty good, the odds of you knocking that out of the chuck are pretty good. So yeah, you work it in, and you can still craft them. It's a little bit trickier for sure than just running a file across it as it's spinning, but it is doable. So as I said, these were kind of hurriedly made. Now this one was very quickly made using only a jewelry file. And you can see it's not very deep. I ran the file more or less across it a little bit. And it really didn't take a whole lot out. So if you're just using a jewelry file, it's going to take a little bit more work than this. But the main thing I wanted you to notice on these, because I said when you make them, make sure you're running your file as flat and level as possible. Because if you don't, they're going to come out like this, where you see they've got a little bit of a kind of cone tapering to them. Now, I mean, you could obviously go with that as the pin if that's what you want it to do. But to get it nice and level, you're going to want to go back and kind of look at them. So, run your file a little bit, stop it, get the pin stopped, take a look at it and see, because you may be actually, even though you think you're filing level, you can see what I did was I had more pressure being applied to the outside of the pin than to the inside, and that gave it that kind of coning. And you may find that you were actually the opposite, and you apply a slightly more pressure on the inside of it than the outside, in which case it's going to cone the other way. So just stop, take a look at it. If it is coning, just kind of readjust a little bit how you're shaping it. Hit it a few swipes, go back, look at it again, and you see you're evening it up. But it is very easy to be making them where they kind of taper instead of being a little more straight and level. Now, being a reduced diameter pin, the odds are it is going to be the last pin to finish, especially if it's your thinnest one in there. And the other thing, like any reduced diameter, you want to be a little bit careful with the key pin that you pair it up with. So if you're reducing the diameter on the key pin as well on the top of it, they can do what the spiky pins do, where they kind of can crank in beside each other a little bit and jam up, and you want to avoid that. So very often what I'll do, just especially if I'm feeling a little bit lazy and don't want to keep experimenting with it, I'll just pair them up with a standard key pin. That way it's going to push in right across it nice and smoothly. Now, of course, to get the most out of the T-pin, you do want it to sit down in that chamber. You do want it to sit down in that chamber as deep as possible, because if you're just sitting up here, you're taking advantage of the T-pin part, but you're losing the advantage in the entire pin. So the more you can get in there, the better. So it kind of works best with shorter key pins. That way you're sure to get the whole thing dropped down in there. Now you can always, if you're just insistent on where you want this and you want it to be a certain height or whatever, you can always take a little bit off of it to try to drop it down in a little bit more. There's no real, concrete way to it. But yeah, if you can get the shear line up above the reduced portion, you're going to get the most use out of the T-pin, because then you're going to get that nice little movement on the core and the click as it goes into the T-pin portion. And that's really what you want. Okay, now if you pair these off with a carefully selected key pin, you've got a pretty good chance of getting overlift in there. Because as you're searching for some kind of feedback, if you've got something, let's say maybe you've reduced the diameter a little bit of the key pin, maybe you've rounded it off a little bit, smoothed it out, tapered it a little bit, something, you may be able to get it that this T-pin sneaks up past the shear line while the person's looking for feedback, and they catch just enough of the key pin in that closing shear line. Because remember, that shear line, as you're picking a lot of these, especially as you're using spools and T-pins, it's going to be kind of ever reducing. But hard enough lift, the picker may start to get some feedback from this, and they're going to start to feel a little bit of counter rotation. It's going to be dulled. It's not going to be quite the snappy counter rotation that you get on something like a straight spool. But you'll feel a little bit of feedback on it. And so what that is going to happen is you may have, you may be able to get the picker to let it counter rotate a little bit, or for them to counter rotate it manually a little bit, and then pop up. And especially if you're running like a serration, deep serration, or a spool type element on the key pin, of course, if you can get them to pop that up past that shear line, it will drop again into a false of some sort. It may not be as deep as it had been with just the T-pin tip, depending on how narrow you have made that. But you may be able to get it to pop up in there, and they may not realize, or they may realize, that they've got an overset. And of course, as they try to adjust and allow for that, they may take off some tension, let the core come back a little bit. Because it's reduced, it's not going to take as much of that chamber opening, and you can get that little nub to drop back in again. So yeah, there we go. Just a quick little look at the Humble T-pin. They're quite simple and clever, and they can be very effective. If you watched any challenge lock videos, you've probably seen a few of these come into play, and they can be a little bit tricky. Just because it's easy. If you can catch that little tip, it's very easy to get it lost up there in that shear line. And the higher it's tipped up in there, of course, because you've got a little bit of wiggle on the key pins and everything as well, and you're applying tension, which is catching the tip of that, it can be difficult to actually get the key pin to press on it, and press on it well enough to dislodge it, just kind of depending on how everything works and flows together in your lock. But there you go. Just work that file on the tip of it as flat and level as you can. Check it every so often that it isn't coming out kind of coned and rounded, and if it is, just go back and adjust and fill in your construction holes, and you will be making decent T-pins like a pro in no time at all. All right, guys. Anyway, just like I said, a little addition to the challenge lock pin installment. Hadn't done that in a while. Still got a lot of types of pins to go through. So yeah, there you go. You guys have a good one.